of their coffins. And it reminds me a little bit about the Egyptian pharaohs who used this sarcophagus as a means of transporting them to the afterlife and converting their stay into something which the community could look at as being more positive or constructive. Not to look at it as a loss, but as something that the person aspires to, and perhaps you may even down the road want to do the same. So whilst perhaps I started off a little morbidly, the idea is not really to be morbid about death, but to say that it is appropriate to fashion your life in a way that allows you to do what I was suggesting in the beginning, to cater for the certainty that at some points along the way, you are going to slip, you're going to fall, but what you should also cater for is that you should rise. And so that is my acknowledgement to the theme of today's event. That is that we need to gear ourselves to rise, whatever the circumstances that may cause us to fall at a specific point. And in doing that, I want to say this to you, that it is especially important that this community, part of the African diaspora, recognizes that its strength is in its capacity to face adversity and rise. No other ethnicity has survived so many years of abuse, violence, misrepresentation, and survived and is kicking. Yes, at any point in time you will find in a particular country or in part of a country the African diaspora fighting or facing difficulties. But this is a diaspora that has also produced some of the world's most gifted people, whether they be in Nigeria, Ghana, Guyana, United States, whether it's in technology, law, or politics. So there is no limit to what we can do. There is no limit to what we can do, even with the entire world against us and abusing us. This is the point I want to make. It is up to us. We have to believe in ourselves and fight those battles as though we believe that we can win in the end. That is the point. So what I'm wanting to say in connection with Guyana has to do with that. And let me also take a minute to apologize for perhaps not referring to some of the colleagues I see in the audience. I'm looking, I see for the Lawrence down the road in front of me. I see Mrs. Pilgrim in the corner here, and Oscar, former General Secretary, and still a stalwart carrying the burdens of the party, and it's carrying up the flag. So what I want to say today isn't particularly profound. I want to say that this theme that we have, that you have agreed on, Still We Rise, in our quest for recognition, justice, and development, is an appropriate one. And the points I want to make are points that say we as a community have to do a certain number of things. We have to recognize where we are, what problems we're having. We have to agree amongst ourselves as to how to tackle these problems, not fool ourselves when there are problems to be addressed. We have to recognize that many of those problems can be solved by the government, but we have to recognize also that many others cannot be solved by the government. We have to do something amongst ourselves, organizationally, institutionally. I heard earlier someone, I think it was Madam President, speaking of the work of forebears who did so much to establish the institutions that enabled us to move from slavery to independence, the establishment of cooperatives, the work done in relation to local government, whether it be Betafawacting or the Currentine or along the Essequibo coast. These were institutional arrangements put in place by Africans, Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, to deal with the challenges before them. After the abolition of slavery, you had the challenge of dealing with an economy in which labor was only partly free. People used to leave the Essequibo coast or islands to come all the way to Demerara to find work in order for them not to find themselves under pressure by plantation owners on the Essequibo who wanted to force their wages down. And in order to force those wages down, would deny them and their children access to schools and so forth. So one way that they tried to deal with that was to come to Demerara, the East Coast in particular, when it's at month end or once a quarter. And that was one of the reasons why you had such a tremendous movement after the 1840s, especially after in the early 1850s, into Demerara by Africans from Essequibo. And therefore, the point I'm making is that institutions such as the cooperatives have to be fashioned by us. We have, when we are leaders or just ordinary members of the community, we have to recognize that these institutions are very, very critical, one, in taking us from one place to another, but more critically, they're important in fashioning our values. Of course, the church had played a role in that regard in the past, in relation to dealing with market economies. When I was a child, every Friday, I think, we had to go to, I was sent to or went with my grandmother to Mission Chapel School, where you had the funeral society. This was where people saved their money every week. And Africans collected that money so that at some point when you needed it to purchase something, whether it's to purchase a house or to get into business, it was there. There was a mechanism, it was a more elaborate form of the box hand. But that was fashioned by them themselves without the intervention of anyone else. There was trust amongst them, and that was a mechanism that enabled them to cope with some of the challenges, such as the unwillingness and sometimes the absolute refusal of commercial banks to lend to Africans. The refusal of the authorities to license Africans to be in certain jobs. They would reserve those for the Portuguese, for example. In many of the hinterland areas, handling the purchase and sale of gold was limited to privileged groups. So, I'm saying to you again, we have always had problems, and we have always found means to deal with those problems. And that is our task. For as long as you're alive, whether or not you are a community and act as part of the diaspora, that's the reality. Of course, it will be a lot easier. Fighting those challenges will be a lot easier if you were to recognize that working together has some major advantages. And we, as a people, I think, very often forget that. We get desperate and restless and go wandering into other things. But there's no substitute for that. The point is that if you have institutions, as today you have a political party, in which most of us find ourselves, you have also to be active in that party, to make sure that it represents your interest, to make sure that when you are not satisfied as to what it's doing and where it's going, you are able to say so. We have come into an era, especially post-1970s and 1980s, where people will, without blinking, say, well, you're a politician, you fix it, you do it, you say this, you say that. But you know, if you leave your vital interests to other people, and politicians are other people, they are going at times to do nonsense. You have to be able to tell them, I don't understand what you're doing, I don't agree with what you're doing, can you explain why you're doing something? And you should participate at all levels. You should participate at, when it is the lowest level. We can't all be the chairmen or presidents or the leaders of the party, but we can all be active members. We can all be active members. It's our responsibility to ensure our interests are represented. You can't depend upon somebody to look after your interests. You absent yourself from wherever it is you're supposed to be, where decisions are made, and when the decisions are made, you despair or complain afterwards. So that's the point I want to make. And I'm going to say to you that if you look around the community, you will see that many challenges face us. To me, the condition of the African diaspora in Guyana, let me call them that for the time being, is at a place where we would not like it to be. It is true that after the problems of the 1980s and the adjustment measures, you did have improvements in the 1990s which enhanced, moved a significant proportion of the Guyana population out of absolute poverty. That is a fact, can't be denied. We contributed to it as a party, and the party in office at the time also contributed to it. But you know, beyond 2000 and in this 21st century in particular, it is clear that growing income disparities, the same income disparities that caused, and wealth disparities that caused our people to vote the way they did in 2015 and to seek to retain office in 2020, those disparities bear very heavily on the African community. And it bears heavily on that community for a number of reasons. Sometimes people dispute this fact. You know, we had in 2015, we had in 2011, approached the PPP government to work with us in dealing with communities in stress. You will remember that President Hoyt had embarked on such a dialogue with PPP. Subsequently, the APNU did this. And that dialogue was not fruitful because there was a denial, for example, that there was any economic distress in a place like Linden and in many of the places we claimed in which there was economic distress. So I say to you, one of the first points is to be aware of what problems you have and to be able to articulate them. Because obviously, the fact that you may experience a problem doesn't mean that somebody else who is not part of your group recognizes this, and that is part of our task, to share that message in addition to trying to do something about it. And I'm saying to you, just like the coffins of Ghana arose as a result of many factors, I mean, I didn't try to explain them, but there were many factors which led to that becoming a commercial thing, even beyond the way that sarcophagi featured in Egypt. In the same way, we face challenges that are multidimensional, and we have to be able to represent ourselves and to know what solutions are going to get us out of those difficulties. And the Many of the economic problems we are facing and the factors contributing to the decline today amongst the African community in Guyana arise from the problems of lack of employment. I'll say this to you as I said to the cabinet, that when you have a community that depends perhaps almost inordinately on wage employment, unemployment in the local government, as well as in the public sector, meaning public service and publicly owned corporations. When those entities are trimmed, when they're reduced, as they have to be from time to time, if you don't manage your economy perfectly, you can't always anticipate what's coming down the road in economics. So sometimes you are going to miscalculate or not anticipate something. When that happens, the traditional methods, and I have to admit being guilty here, the discipline of economics and of international finance relies very heavily on cutting or utilizing, moving the levels of government expenditure as an economic tool. So when you can't balance, you cut expenditures, when the revenues are not sufficient. And that is reflected in the government, the bills that the government takes on. It's reflected in the number of people that are employed by the state directly and indirectly, and it is reflected in the drive to collect more taxes and inability to provide services. These are related. It's not because they don't like you. I mean, I'm listening to the dialogue, to the commentaries taking place outside, and it seems to me that we are a people with a very, very short memory. Very, very short indeed. And when I say we are people, I mean Guyanese in general, I mean the press. You would believe not that what was done would have been done perfectly or in the best way that it might. You believe that Critchlow, in his work mobilizing the world's first trade union, didn't face problems. You believe that come the 1960s, containerization didn't lead to a whole set of employees being laid off from the docks, most of whom would have been the sort of employees represented by Critchlow in his time. These were dock workers, and that is how come you got the disappearance of residences in Tiger Bay. You believe that the bauxite industry did lay off some 6,000 workers, and today the bauxite industry, which employed more than 6,000 workers in the 1980s, doesn't employ 600 Guyanese. Okay? You would believe that sugar estates were never closed. You would believe that sugar estates were never closed. Those of you who come from Burmese, let me not talk about Demerara, would know that one of the achievements that the PPP lays claim to is of the initiating of the Blackbush Border Drainage and Irrigation Scheme. That drainage and irrigation scheme came about because the closure of the estates in the Upper Quarantine left a lot of people out of work. And that's how Blackbush Border was established, as a scheme to absorb the labor. So we had about 100 sugar estates in 1900. What happened to all of them? They didn't all get closed in 2019 or 2017. They did not. Okay, they've been closed over the years by the colonialists, they've been closed by bookers, they've been closed by the PPP, and they were closed by APNU AFC. As I say, you may argue as to whether timing or quantum, that's a different matter, but let us not forget, or let us not behave as though this is the handiwork of the devil. And I'm not addressing that remark to you, I'm addressing it to the press, which comments on these things. And that is the impression you get from reading the newspapers and hearing the commentaries. The employment opportunities are important, whether they be to sugar workers or others. As I say, they're especially important to this community because the bulk of the public servants, that is the so-called public service, and those who are employed in public corporation are from this community. So if there's a disproportionate cut in employment in that arena, we are going to bear the brunt of those cuts, as indeed we did in our time in the late 1970s when there was redeployment. You might remember that term if you're old enough. And subsequently in the 1990s when the PPP and the IMF programs also cut employment. So it's not a peculiarity of one party. But what I'm saying to you, that if it is government employment that is cut, it has a disproportionate impact on our community. And it means then that there are challenges now in finding jobs for those who have either been laid off or those who find themselves having to look for other forms of employment. And the challenge that you face in such circumstances are the challenges that we face now. Why is it that, well, leave out discrimination for the time being, because I think government action I'm going to leave to talk about another time. But what is it can we do as members of the diaspora to ensure that our youngsters, because they are going to be the ones seriously affected, our youngsters are able to find gainful employment as we go forward. The question of education is very important. And again, I don't want to speak about education, but what I want to say is that for our young people, and even the older ones, to survive in the job market, especially where you're faced by all sorts of constraints and discrimination, we as a community have to pay attention to what is happening. The values amongst our young people, the work ethic amongst our young people are constituting a problem. If you don't realize that education goes a long way in ensuring that you are needed as an employee, then you're in trouble. It's our job to ensure that they're aware of that. This is what my parents and grandparents did an exceptionally good job on. And when I say mine, our generation, that is the generation in the 60s and 70s. And we have to maintain those values amongst our young people. This is a time, that is the 21st century and beyond, in which it is going to be impossible for you to be other than flotsam and jetsam in the streets if you are not so educated that you can flexibly move between different types of jobs. Familiarity with the internet, familiarity with issues to do with information technology and so forth are critical in this regard. And we have to encourage our young people to develop educational values as well as job place values. And the general education ones, I don't think we need to tell you about. But one of the things, for example, I just draw to your attention, I was involved in having my car fixed by a party colleague in South. And I'm complaining to him that I see a lot of youngsters passing every day. They come, I saw people working with him, and then I go back a month later and they're no longer there. Say, why is it that you as a manager can't keep these young people, train them, expand your business so that they can carry it forward? And then he showed me an incident which he said was fairly typical, where the young people in the area, and this is in South, so I can tell you, often on Friday or Saturdays will pass by, stop and chat, and ask for a small piece so that they could go to a show or whatever it is that's going on, which he had no difficulty with. But you know, it is those very young people that would come when he's away or when he's busy working and discourage other young people who are working with him. Discourage them from working by saying, you're going to make that man rich. Why are you so stupid that you're going to work to make that man rich? Something is going wrong within our community. That our people, our young people, or a significant proportion of our young people, don't understand what is required to exist in a society. If nobody works, we starve to death. If nobody works, we'll starve to death. Everybody cannot work for themselves. And where people join together to work, that is part of the mechanism that has brought us out of the Middle Ages. You have to work together. If you don't want to work for someone, that is cool, but you now have to go and work for yourself. And if you work for yourself, you cannot come to the workplace and complain that, well, you didn't eat this morning, and the man who's building the house should feed you. Because other businesses, those who are self-employed, come and they work without that requirement. Do you understand what I'm saying? You have to understand the marketplace in which you exist. And we have to ensure that all of our people understand that. Otherwise, you're always going to be at a disadvantage. These are the values, I'm saying, that depend upon you as a mother, you as a father, you as an elder brother in a household. That is what we have to work on. The school can only do some of that. The community can do some of it if you have clubs or societies, and that is why I say to you, what I'm speaking about is not just depending upon the government to implement policies. Our advancement, the rise to which we're making reference here, is a rise that also depends on us. We must know where our interests lie. We must know what we require to move forward. And you have to spread that ethic, those values amongst the community in which you live. It is to me extremely important. We see in the communities, I mean, I can refer to places in town. I didn't grow up in Georgetown, but I spent quite a lot of time in Norton Street, where I have relatives at 2 or 3 points along Norton Street. Princess Street, East Randveld, and you can see what is happening in those areas in terms of employment, in terms of the growth of even gangs, this sort of thing amongst youngsters. We have to address those issues. The community, even yesterday we were chatting with some people about Camptown, the steel band and the football ground. I see that with the assistance of one of our comrades, work is being done on the building where the steel band was housed in the past. Atlantic, I think, Chronicle Atlantic. The football ground has not been used for a long time. But these are in the middle of African areas where we have allowed facilities to deteriorate, where young people can't be mobilized, and the culture of the entire area seems to be dominated by what one might call negative vibes. Okay? We have to fix that. The government, least of all, a government that is in place now, can't fix that for us. We as individuals, members of the party, members of church or others, have to work. And the party, I believe, has to understand that it has to collaborate with these civic groups to try and build their own capacity to raise awareness and build and strengthen values within the community. I don't want to sound like a preacher, because really I'm not good at these things. Economics is my discipline. But it is clear that economic development is not only about money, it's not only about cash, it has to do with values in the society, the factors necessary to drive the society. If you can't inspire your youths, have them involved in the development of the community, we have no place to go. Because our future is with our young people. So, that's the sort of message I just wanted to convey to you. Other societies adapt, we also have to adapt. The physical locations in which many of our communities now exist are a problem. If young ladies, young men grow up in communities, almost every community in the areas I talked about find themselves after nightfall or even before nightfall with a whole set of bars in the community, no distinction between residents and non-commercial areas. These matters, and I'm not speaking specifically to Oscar here, but I'm glad, I know that you will understand the problem. These areas, to the extent that they physically deteriorate, and our people are growing up in that physical deterioration, is going to have implications for the quality of young women, for the quality of young people, for the quality of discourse, for the safety with which you walk on the road, the physical safety with which you walk on the road. It is as extreme as that. Today, if you walk down Regent Street to school, you can walk on the pavement. But if you want to walk down Regent Street, if you wanted to walk down Regent Street yesterday, you would have to walk on the road. And you know most of our accidents take place. Four-wheel vehicles with power against pedestrians and people on two wheels. They take place in the city and they take place in rural areas. And we are in a situation where those who are relatively well off with motor cars and buses and so forth seem to be having, and I'm not excluding myself from that because that is the reality, where the poor or the poorer elements of the community are the ones that are exposed and most vulnerable because they have to walk to work, or they have to walk, they try to walk on the pavement because the pavements are overcrowded for all sorts of reasons. They find themselves competing with motor cars in Sherry Street, for example, not only Regent Street and Rock Street. Something is wrong with that. This is a city that has moved from being a planned city with residential areas in which it was reasonably safe to exist to a city that is like a slum. In many ways, Georgetown is very close to the favelas in the neighboring countries of Venezuela and Brazil in particular. And that means that you are at risk physically, health-wise also. Health-wise, because the concentration of people in areas resulting from low household incomes, many people in a room, and so forth, has all sorts of implications. We started off with handicaps. I heard the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies speaking a couple of days ago on the impact of slavery on the African population in our countries. You know by looking at the medical statistics that one of the most prevalent features of our society are sort of intestinal illnesses arising from water problems, giving you diarrhea, dehydration, and so forth. But that is purely the result of poverty and poor infrastructure on the part of the government. But more importantly, diabetes, hypertension, and latterly obesity. These are things that inflict, that are prevalent in this community more than you will find them amongst other ethnicities. Even amongst Africans in Africa, it's greater here than there. And so we start off with handicaps. If you already have those handicaps, you have to be addressing them, and you should not sit and allow a government or your local government or your RDCs to compound those difficulties. These are at the heart of your very existence. So I wanted just to draw these points to your attention and to say to you that all of us have a role at the different levels that we operate to rise in the way that we are hoping to in the theme that has been so carefully chosen here. I wanted to say that all of us have a role. We are going to be challenged, and we need both professional help and the muscle of day-to-day people to help us to build institutions, to revisit the churches and the clubs in the churches, to establish clubs. In the old days, we had a whole variety of clubs that helped to groom young people. Many of them have disappeared, or they seem to have not been as effective as they were. And so we need to ensure that things such as values, workplace values, things such as business practices. One of the things, of course, if you go to the businessman, the need to know when you have to save. You can't have a minibus and spend all the money you collect from the minibus each day, because it means you can't do the maintenance, you can't buy fuel, and you always have to be borrowing from somebody to do what is maintenance. So these are problems we face. Sometimes it is the result of people not being aware of what is required of them, and we should put in place the mechanisms to ensure that they understand what is required of them. The importance of tools even amongst our young work people is something that you'll be amazed at from time to time. People appear, whether they're doing plumbing or what have you, and they don't think it's important to have tools. They borrow, you have, and if you don't have, they go off to go and borrow. So I don't want to give you a story of depression. I'm simply saying to you, we have challenges, and we have as a community to try and organize ourselves to deal with those. And also on the part of leadership, I just want to end with a rather long quotation from Ayikwe, who is one of the earliest of the African authors. He's a Ghanaian, so it's perhaps fitting that one should resort to a Ghanaian for some words of wisdom. And in speaking of the leadership now, whether it is the highest level or at other levels in between, this is a story. If you ever get the chance, you should have a look at his first famous international novel, which is entitled The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. It's a very interesting novel about problems and corruption in Ghana in the 1960s and 70s. But he's saying here, there's a dialogue taking place between two people in the book, and in this case, the one person is saying to his teacher, "Teacher, my wife explained," you know, women of course have to be blamed for everything. So it's a hard lesson here. He's identified his wife as being the source of the hardness. So forgive me for that. I'm only reading from what he wrote. He said, "My wife explained to me step by step that life was like a lot of long roads. A lot of roads. Long roads, short roads, wide and narrow, steep and level, all sorts of roads. And next, she let me know that human beings were like people driving cars on these roads." This was the point, he said, at which she told me that those who wanted to get far, they had to learn to drive fast. And then she asked, that is the teacher, asked me what name I would give to people who were afraid to drive fast or to drive at all. I had no name to give her, but she hadn't finished. Accidents would happen, she told me. But fear of accidents would never keep men from driving. And Joe Kumsi had learned to drive. In other words, you are looking for leaders that aren't afraid to go ahead of you and to carry you with them. That is the lesson I'm learning from here. That is the task of leadership, to lead and to not be afraid to lead. Okay, so that's the lesson. That's the lesson from Economist and his Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And I'd like to thank you for your patience, for the music, the poetry, and even the maybe unintended diversions. Thank you very much for your time.